Well, let's bring in now two people who have got a great sense from both sides of the border as to what this means to the Western effort in Afghanistan. Joining us from Toronto is Chris Alexander, Canada's former ambassador to Afghanistan. And from Washington, I'm joined by Chris Sands of the Hudson Institute. Thanks very much for being here. Chris, let me start with you. Chris Alexander, you just heard Janice Mackey-Fraser saying that in her conversation with Abdullah just a few hours ago, he made it very clear that there was going to be no power sharing as far as he was concerned. It sounds like there is increased and continuing instability in that country. Is that your read?
Certainly, the biggest problem remains insecurity, which has been the principal reason why the election wasn't as successful and credible as it should have been. The Taliban attacked the process from beginning to end, and they intimidated enough Afghans to stay away from the polls, to create the space for the fraud that took place. At the same time, there's a minor victory being celebrated in that a constitutional result has been salvaged. A lot of fraudulent votes were thrown out. President Karzai will have a legal and constitutional mandate to govern.
Chris Sands, let me throw it to you in Washington now. President Obama said today he phoned Hamid Karzai to congratulate him and recognize that he is the winner of this election where no votes were cast. But he did say, basically, you're on probation. We need to see a greater degree of transparency and read for that a greater degree of non-corruption within your government. How solid is America's support for Hamid Karzai right now?
Well, I'm not sure how solid Americans' policy with regard to Afghanistan is. It's amazing to see the United States so reactive to conditions on the ground. Contrast this with the famous breakthrough election in Iraq, where the Americans knew that there had to be security for the voting. We came in with allies, but mainly the U.S. Army, making sure that people felt safe voting so that we could get someone who was elected free and fair. Here, we stand on the sidelines still debating whether we're willing to put additional troops in and commit to counterinsurgency, or whether we're going to have a completely different plan. We don't not only debate that, we debate it in the open so that it's clear that there's indecisiveness in the White House, that there's a disagreement between the White House and some of the key generals that this president appointed. I think for us to say, well, you're on probation, I'm not sure that President Obama has yet gotten out of his probation as a wartime leader with regard to Afghanistan. I think that it's not his place to tell people they're on probation. He needs to get himself organized here.
Let me throw a question to both of you, and please join in the conversation, but let me start with Chris Alexander. When you get to a point where you've had an election that nobody views really as being a credible election, when you've got an American president, as Chris Sands was just saying, who's still sitting on the sidelines, sort of almost doing a Hamlet routine, undecided about what he wants to do about Afghanistan, it does seem, how close do you get to the point then when the enthusiasm goes out of prosecuting this war any further? I mean, it seems that the people at the top on this side have got a lot of concerns that can't be addressed in any solid way in the very near future. Chris Alexander, why don't you start?
Well, I think Chris is absolutely right that successful counterinsurgency depends on showing determination and resolve to protect the population, to continue building institutions. There are important decisions ahead in Washington and elsewhere in that respect. At the same time, this has been the year since 2001 when we've seen the greatest military buildup in Afghanistan so far. New resources are on the ground, and it is starting to make a difference. The question is, will there be follow-through? Will there be, in addition to the military commitment, civilian investment in the institutions that should be coming into focus behind President Karzai to deliver services to the population? The team that he has in his cabinet is much better than it was 2 or 3 years ago, and most observers on the ground think they deserve support.
Chris Sands, let me throw to you, because you brought up American public opinion. I've been watching it recently, not only the decline of support for President Obama, he's lost about 20% of his support, or 20 points rather, in his approval rating in just the last 3 or 4 months, but also there's a very rapidly diminishing appetite for this war in the United States, as you tend to be more focused on the healthcare debate there. How much longer do you think the United States can remain engaged in a major way in this war?
Well, I think that you saw this a little bit on the Iraq numbers during the war when it looked like we were losing. The American public has very little interest in spending billions of dollars and losing more lives if it's a loss. And the debate here has been very domestic, a little parochial, talking about, Lyndon Johnson and can we afford major entitlement changes, including new health care reform and other things, at the same time that we have a very costly war that seems to escalate. I think this is the dilemma for President Obama. You need to provide either a real commitment, and more troops, we can debate the number, there are different proposals out there, but it means real resources. The things Canada's done right with regard to Afghanistan is it's not just provided troops, it's provided development assistance, real technical assistance in terms of improving governance, real diplomatic assistance in terms of helping the Afghan government reach out to other governments around the world, including NATO partners, but also others. It's been a full spectrum effort. The U.S. has been on that page as well, and I agree with what Chris Alexander is saying. Tremendous progress has been made, but all the signals from Washington now are maybe we can hold this up. And I think that sends two signals. One to Afghans, you're on probation, well, maybe the Americans aren't going to stay with you, so why should you risk your neck if you're Abdullah to try to take on the presidency of a divided nation, or even if you're Karzai, why don't you send all your money to a Swiss bank account and plan to get out before you're on the roof of the American embassy trying to get out fast? Because we've sent a very worrying signal to them, but to the American public you're sending the signal that we're just sort of playing games here. We had the worst in October, the worst death count we've had in Afghanistan for U.S. troops since the beginning of the conflict. And that's pretty serious when we seem to be aimlessly wandering around in the mountains of Afghanistan without a plan. So I think that this period of indecision, you called it Hamlet-like, I think that's right, has got to end one way or the other. Having the Afghans make their minds up is, I guess, a step in the right direction, but now we've got to figure out how do we get the American mind made up. From that, everyone else from Canada to Afghanistan will figure out what do we do next.
Chris Alexander, we've only got a very short time left, but how do you continue selling the war in Canada when we've got a corrupt administration in Kabul and no resolution to that in sight?
Well, the way to go from Hamlet to Henry V, quite frankly, is to demand some answers to the question Secretary of State Hillary Clinton asked in Pakistan. Why is it that 8 years later, everyone knows where the top leadership of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda are living, training, facilitating, mobilizing, and nothing is being done against those sanctuaries? That's the key question. We can't look at Afghanistan in isolation from the one key neighbor, Pakistan, and from its region.
Chris Alexander, Chris Sands, Hill to Hill on Afghanistan. Thanks very much, both of you, for being here. Good discussion. We're going to take a short break.